Welcome back, listener. How are you? We're glad you're doing well, and I'm glad you had a good week. This is Aaron Richmond, the host of Aaron's Opinion, the podcast for blind people where we talk about critical issues in the blindness community. Aaron's Opinion can be heard almost everywhere you get a podcast, from Apple to Spotify to Spreaker. You name it, we're probably there. We're also on YouTube, also on Twitter, Facebook, and Patreon. By the way, so that I don't have to interrupt us at the third, basically halfway through, I would like to say that Aaron's Opinion is sponsored by Blended Joe LLC. It's a coffee company, BLENDEDJOE.com. They have all sorts of coffee to support all sorts of charitable causes. As I like to say, 20% off until the end of the month. So you just have a couple days to make the use of that coupon. Promo code Aaron, AARON, 20% off. I guarantee if you're at home or on the go, you'll love every sip from Blended Joe. And in the studio tonight, we have someone who has been on my podcast many times. He's a great friend and another great podcaster. You guys know him, Michael Michael Munn from Michael's Weekly Perspective. He joins us. How are you?
I'm doing great, actually. I had my first week of school as a junior in high school.
Excellent. Well, very good. I'm very glad to hear that. So I would like to get into the topic and ask you, because it will help our listeners to understand this. Michael, number one, why did you get into podcasting in the first place? There are several reasons. Tell us why you got into it.
The first reason that I'm into podcasting is because I have a lot of friends who have this job as a podcaster, like Jonathan Mosen. I'm calling people out in this case.
What about Aaron Richmond?
Oh yes, of course.
Oh, okay.
You are also another friend, but the person who really inspired me, including you and Jonathan, to start a podcasting, to start podcasting for fun.
And, right.
Yeah, Jonathan Mosen's FS Cast was the first podcast that I listened to when I was a JAWS user in 2016. And on October 24th, actually around that time, when I turned on my computer, back then it was an HP and still an HP, and when I turn on my computer, there's a dialog pop up, and I press tab just to find the OK button to get out. Instead of out of the dialog box, it brings me to the Windows Media Player and begin to play the latest episode of FS Cast, which is Freedom Scientific's official podcast. And that's how I really into podcasting. That's how I started listening to podcast.
I see. And I thought that you were also very inspired by my podcast too, to start your own podcast.
Oh yes, yeah. Last year I was doing, my things, like not podcasting, of course. I was doing my regular things like doing schoolworks, and you sent me a text on Messenger says if I would like to be a guest on your podcast, and you send me this link called Anchor so I can join it. But due to the technical difficulties back then, I have a phone that's 8 years. It was made in 2013, so it's not competitive with Anchor. So, I skipped the first chance, and then we eventually connected by Skype. So that's that's how you inspired me to start a podcasting.
And what made you choose Anchor? I mean, there's a lot of companies out there that are wonderful companies that do a great job in hosting podcasts. What made you choose Anchor in the first place?
See, I saw the link that I received from you, and then a couple months later, I got a phone that works twice fast as my 5S. It's an 11 Pro, and I began to play with it. And I believe on December 20th, which is a Thursday, I recorded a trailer and everybody began to love it. Plus, Anchor is a free program that allow me to produce a podcast without soliciting money from me.
Right. Without you having to pay for it.
Oh,
Right.
yes.
Exactly. Exactly. Um, I'll tell you, I started with Anchor, but what I noticed about the product is that it's an excellent product for recording material and storing recordings. However, it does not automatically connect me to YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and Apple Podcasts. And that was something that I wanted to be able to do. I wanted to be able to take a podcast and put it onto YouTube seamlessly and automatically. So that's why I go with Spreaker. Um, and that's why Spreaker is really my favorite. They've hosted my podcast for since the spring, so at least about 5 months, 6 months, 4 to 5 months now.
That's awesome. Yeah, I
Hmm.
have to write to Anchor just to put my podcast on Apple.
Yeah, and that should not have been the case. You should not have to. I mean, I am not saying this to be critical, and I am not criticizing Anchor. Anchor is great, but in my own opinion, you shouldn't have to write to a podcast a hosting agency telling them to distribute your podcast on the world's most critical and most pliable catalog, which is Apple. That's the most important one, arguably.
Oh, yes.
So that's kind of what deterred me. Not really deterred me, I want to say, but that's kind of what kind of turned me off. If they had put me onto Apple, I would have I would have probably stuck with it, you see. Here's what I want to know, and this is a question that I think you would have an answer to, or I don't know if you would know this, but you're very knowledgeable about many things, Michael. So let's say in the future, right, that my current hosting company, let's say in the future, God forbid, I doubt it would happen, but let's say that they somehow went out of business, right?
Yes.
Or let's say that I wanted to take my RSS from one host to another host, right? So if I'm already on Apple and I move my RSS from one thing to another, wouldn't that disrupt Apple, or would Apple not even notice? Do you even understand what I'm asking?
Oh, yes, you are basically asking if you switch your host and would Apple notice that you are switching to a different
Yeah,
host?
because would it in Apple in the software's eyes, the way that the software sees it? I've been meaning to ask someone about this because I've been pondering it. So you take your RSS, right? But what if your RSS is already connected to Apple? Then does that mean that because you cannot have two of the same podcasts on Apple, it's against their terms of service. Obviously they can't allow that. So would that mean that I would have to just rename my podcast? Or does it just sort of recycle itself and not really notice? What do you think? Do you have any perception of that? Any theory?
That I really don't know because I haven't experienced with it. And I did start my podcast on SoundCloud with the same names. And, they didn't do any background checks.
Right, but what I'm saying is, let me phrase it this way: does SoundCloud provide you with a SoundCloud RSS?
That I haven't checked, so I cannot tell you.
Yeah, basically, the RSS, Michael, as we know in the podcast world, is just our ID, our kind of our identification number. It's a link,
Yes.
but it's just basically our number, our ID number.
Oh,
And
yes.
that's how each podcast is basically valid, because every podcast on Apple has to have an appropriate RSS code. It has to be coded properly. But at least do you understand what I'm asking though? Like, if you're already on Apple, but then you want to switch hosts, then how would that affect Apple? I'm just wondering that. Would that just recycle itself, or would they make you change the name? I think they would. My guess would be either it wouldn't have any effect, or they would send you an email and say, hey, you probably need to rename your podcast and just start over from where you are. That I don't know.
I would think the same. They probably will
What
let you. They probably won't delete your episodes, but they do require you to rename the podcast.
I see. So you would just basically your theory is if it came to it, and if I had to switch hosts, I would just have to rebrand. I would just have to come up with a new title for my
Oh
thing.
yes,
I would just have to simply rebrand it. But nothing would be lost along the way.
yes.
Right. Right.
That's
I
that's what I
see.
would think.
I see. Yeah, yeah. Or they wouldn't notice because once it gets to Apple, it's just an RSS in Apple, so it wouldn't necessarily be noticeable. But I don't know. I don't know. I'm sure that the different hosts can, if you asked, and if you needed to switch to my hosting company or other hosting companies, you should ask that. You should know, how will this affect my Apple, um, you know, not standing. How will this affect your iTunes page? Because that's really is the most critical. But are you uploading to YouTube yet?
Oh no, I have a
Hmm.
YouTube channel, and I only use that to feature to give the listeners a heads up on who I'm going to talk to.
That's excellent. I'm liking what I'm hearing here. So you're using YouTube as a promotional tool, not as a distribution tool. That's
No,
in right. Yes, yes. Yes. I understand. Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's interesting. I think that since I have since I'm able to do it, and since all I have to do is push a button and my podcast, my voice goes on all the platforms and on YouTube all at the same time within 30 seconds,
yeah,
I just make the most of that. I just put it up there. Um, you know, and actually, listener, you can tell me, and I don't need you to tell me, more of you are watching my YouTube videos than you are listening to my podcast, because I have more subscribers on YouTube than I have followers on my hosting software. So you're out there, and I know that you prefer the YouTube videos. So that's, that might be something that you would, take a closer look at. But I agree with you. YouTube can be a very effective place to advertise, um, and Twitter too. Yeah, you just have
oh
to have
yes,
the trick is to find a host at some point, is to find a hosting software that does all of it like all at once, like with one click, one touch, one tap, and it's there all at once. That's the trick.
for
Hmm.
sure. And
Yeah.
also, as a podcaster, we also have to be clever when using the social media account, such as Facebook, Twitter, and WhatsApp.
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, I think that one of the things that I really love about Spreaker is that they take care of all of it for me. They tweet for me. They brand the tweet and they type it up. The software types it up so I don't have to do that. Or the same thing on my Facebook page. It's all typed up for me, and then it's just automatic. It's just like a machine that just pushes it out. It's like a printer. Yeah, it's really cool. It's really, really cool.
That's
And this
amazing.
Yeah, yeah. So that's why I'm using that software. That's why I would argue that that's Spreaker. Spreaker is the best. Um, I wonder. I'm trying to think.
I did get a play on Spreaker a week ago, and for some reason, it does not allow me to upload the pictures of my podcast. They say it is too big, the size.
Yeah. You mean yeah, the image. You mean your like profile picture that comes up on your podcast, like your bright green picture with like the braille dots. That picture.
Oh yes, yeah, it won't allow
That's
me
what they
to do that.
that's what they didn't like. Okay, well that might be some AI. Okay, this partially answers my question. That might be some artificial intelligence telling the Spreaker software that your podcast is already on Apple. I think that's what that might be.
Oh, okay.
So I think we're solving this as we go through it. I don't know. Um I'm tempted to see. I mean, I'm not gonna ask the question directly, But Michael, if I hear the answer in the community, I'll let you know what the answer is. I think that's what that